Judge Clark slammed her gavel, dismissing Darius Coleman's plea as if his voice didn't matter. Accused of trespassing in his own home and resisting arrest, he was supposed to bow his head in shame. Instead, Darius stood tall, daring to challenge the very court that tried to silence him, armed only with his mind and the law he taught himself. But when a judge mocks a defendant and he turns out to know the law better than her, what happens next? If this makes you pause, hit like and share. Now, let's uncover the truth in that courtroom. I was in the second row when the doors hit. Heavy oak swung hard by a bailiff who didn't bother to look back. The smack ricocheted off marble and glass and seemed to vacuum the air out of the room. People stopped rustling. Even the fluorescent lights felt louder. That's how it is in this courtroom. Sound becomes a warning before a word is spoken. They brought him in through the side door. Darius Coleman, early 30s, black. A thrift store suit that did its best and a pair of shoes worn thin at the edges, like he'd walked a long way to get here. He kept his head up, but not high, just enough to meet the world without inviting it to swing. You notice the small things first, the tired crease in his shirt, the careful way he placed each foot, the quick scan he gave the gallery, as if counting exits and witnesses all at once. The bailiff guided him straight down the aisle palm, hovering at Darius's back the way you steer a cart you don't quite trust. Right before they reached the defense table, the bailiff leaned toward a row of regulars and said under his breath, "Another trespasser." This won't take long. It wasn't meant for the microphones, but it was meant to be heard. A couple of chuckles slipped out. Someone clicked their tongue in that figures kind of way. The case hadn't even been called, and verdicts were already forming like fog on glass. On the bench, Judge Meredith Clark, mid-50s, immaculate robe posture that could balance a law book. Around here, they call her tough. Tough can mean fair when you're lucky. Today, tough was the kind of stillness that judges learn to use like a blade. She swept her eyes across the room. Prosecutor's table, public seats, the press row, in back, then pinned them on Darius like a tack. The clerk read the caption. State versus Coleman. 2 counts. Trespassing and resisting arrest. Some charges are loud on their own. These are quiet until you hear where they come from. A white neighbor saw Darius trying to get into an apartment door and didn't recognize him. Dialed the police. By the time officers arrived, Darius was still there, key in hand, explaining lease in his phone, the kind of proof people of color always know to carry and somehow never get credit for having. According to the report, when he asked why he was being cuffed, the line flipped and resisting arrest landed on him like a second lock. If you attend enough of these, you learn how fast words can make a person disappear. Trespass in your own home is just a headline until your wrists ache from the metal. Resisting is just a checkbox until it becomes the story that drowns out the first story. Non-compliant, the report said, which often means asked a question. It takes less than a minute to turn a misunderstanding into a record that follows you to job interviews, apartments, school, conferences, and every traffic stop after this one. Across the aisle, Ethan Rowe. The young prosecutor flipped a pen in a way that said he'd done this before and it had gone his way. He had that freshman, swagger case, law-tabbed hair, neat smile, ready for when the judge looked his direction. He didn't glance at Darius. He didn't have to. People like Darius arrived to court with the gravity already pushing down. Darius stood where the bailiff placed him and eased into the chair without looking like he was retreating. The gallery kept a low murmur, the kind of buzz that carries a message. This is minor. It'll be quick. We all have lunches to get to. I watched Darius set his hands on the table. No trembling, just careful. His left thumb brushed an old wristwatch, the leather-worn gray at the bend. Later I'd hear that it was his father's watch that his dad used to tap the face and tell him, "Time is where they'll try to take your dignity. Don't hand it over." In that moment, I only saw the thumb circle the glass once slow like a ritual to keep hands from clenching. Judge Clark cleared her throat. Not loud, but final. She had the file, but she didn't open it. She had the man, and that seemed to be enough. "Mr. Coleman," she said, and you could hear the room lean toward the first decision of the day. He answered, "Yes, Your Honor." Not loud, not soft. A voice that had learned to make itself fit in spaces that didn't want it. "Counsel," the judge asked the defense table, even though the chair beside Darius was empty. He didn't have a lawyer. You get used to that too, how poverty sits in the second seat. "I'm representing myself," Darius said. He didn't say it like a dare. He said it the way a man says I can walk after you have asked 3 times if he needs help. The judge's lips pressed together, a small straight line that could mean a lot of things and none of them mercy. Somewhere behind me, a man snorted. Someone else whispered, "Here we go." The bailiff shifted his weight, already bored. There is a moment in every hearing when the room decides what story it's watching. Sometimes it's a simple one, another docket, another plea, move it along. But sometimes a different story taps on the window. I saw the hint of it when Darius squared his shoulders, not puffed up, just aligned, as if he were hanging a picture level in a crooked hallway. He glanced at the gallery, not seeking sympathy, only measuring the distance between his voice and the back row. The clerk finished the formalities. The judge looked down from the bench as if the bench were a cliff and the rest of us were shoreline. "Proceed," she said, a single word that in this room means the floor belongs to people who know how to keep it. I looked at Darius. He took a breath that filled his chest but didn't lift his chin. He was not here to perform. He was here to stand. To insist that home still meant a key and a name on a lease, not a permission slip from a stranger. To insist that a question to an officer was not a crime. In the front row, a woman in a church hat shook her head with that weary smile people wear when they've seen this movie too many times. 2 seats over, a college kid held up his phone pretending to check messages while his camera caught everything. The press in back sat still. There's a tension you don't want to scare away. Darius's thumb found the watch again. Tap, tap. He leaned into the small mic that had silenced bigger men and said, "Your Honor," the bailiff coughed to remind him the room belongs to someone else. His cough wasn't needed. The gavel came down before Darius could lay a single brick of his defense. A single strike, not harsh, not loud, just certain. The kind of sound that tells a man which parts of the Constitution are paper and which parts are doorways. I felt it in my ribs. The room did too. You could hear the laugh that didn't quite make it out of someone's nose, the scrape of a shoe, the rustle of a case file closing early. In that space between the first word and the first refusal, a story chose its spine. Darius didn't flinch. He set his hands flat, palms down, watch face warm against the wood. He looked up at the woman on the bench as if she were a mountain and a mirror at once. The gallery leaned forward. The prosecutor rolled his pen again. And the heavy doors, the ones that had stolen the air at the start, seemed to be listening for who would claim it back. Darius rose slowly, the scrape of his chair legs swallowed by the hush that settled over the room. He smoothed the front of his worn jacket, cleared his throat, and leaned just enough toward the microphone. "Your Honor," he began steady but low, "I am not guilty. I have a signed lease. I have the keys. That apartment is my home." The words barely crossed the space before Judge Clark's gavel cracked against the block. A single sharp note like a lid snapping shut. "Defendants like you." She cut in her voice, cold as stone waste this court's time. "Sit down." The sound that followed wasn't silence. It was laughter. Quick, mean laughter, the kind that doesn't ask permission. A man in the gallery leaned forward, smirking. "He thinks he owns the place." The chuckles spread like ripples, each one telling Darius that the courtroom had already chosen its side. The bailiff stepped forward, heavy boots echoing, and pressed a hand down on Darius's shoulder. It wasn't just pressure, it was weight. The weight of the state of the badge of every locked door that had ever swung shut in a black man's face. He forced him back into his seat, muttering low, almost polite, but not really. "Sit down, son." Darius's hands gripped the edge of the table. I could see the tremor in his fingers, the way sweat broke along his temple. His jaw clenched not to hold words in, but to keep his dignity from spilling out onto the floor. For a breath, you could see him falter, like maybe he would surrender, nod along, let it pass, just another day, just another wound. But something flickered across his face, not from the present, but the past. You could almost see the memory rise up inside him. His father once denied the right to vote in the very county that preached democracy, standing outside a polling station, jaw set, eyes filled with the same wary fire. And he had told his boy once, when the weight of silence pressed hardest, "They'll try to make quiet your weapon. Don't hand it to them." Darius blinked hard, chest rising and falling, and for a moment, he wasn't just a man in a chair, he was a vessel for something larger. The room didn't see it, the judge didn't notice, the bailiff thought his job was done. But those of us who were watching closely could feel it. He swallowed, lowered his gaze to the table, and his thumb found that old watch again, circling the glass face like it held the seconds of courage he needed to borrow. His silence in that moment wasn't surrender. It was gathering. A silence that felt less like defeat, more like a storm tightening its grip before breaking loose. And I'll tell you, sitting there, you couldn't miss the cruelty of it. A man with proof in his pocket, a lease with his name, a key that fit the lock, and still his voice was struck down before it could stand. If you weren't angry yet, you were now. The courtroom had conspired to shut him up, to stuff him back into the box where black men have been placed for generations. But in that brief pause, in that breath where laughter still lingered and sweat still stung his brow, you could feel the weight shift, because you knew this wasn't over. This was only the start. Darius tried once more. He rose slowly this time, as if measuring the weight of every eye in the room, his hands pressed against the table for balance. His voice carried across the microphone, low, deliberate, but firm enough to demand notice. "Your Honor," he said, "the charge of resisting arrest is false. The cameras in my building show I never fought. I never raised a hand. I only asked the officers why I was being taken away. It should have been enough. A simple statement backed by evidence. Proof that the case against him was a house of cards. For a heartbeat, I thought it might land. That maybe the truth would be allowed to breathe." But Judge Clark didn't even bother to turn a page in the file. She snapped the gavel down so hard the clerk's pen jumped. "Dismissed," she declared, sharp as a blade. "Your plea means nothing here." The words echoed in the chamber. Cold, flat, final. A hush fell thick and suffocating before someone in the back let out a cruel laugh. "Told you he's done." The chuckle spread like a crack in plaster. A few heads shook, smirks appearing across the gallery. Not one person stood for him. Not one voice asked to hear more. Darius's shoulders sagged. He lowered himself into the chair, and though the weight of the gavel had crushed his spine, his hands curled into fists on the table, knuckles pressing white, not from anger, but from the desperate act of holding himself together. His head bowed, and in that posture you could see something break. The bailiff stepped close, leaning in until his lips nearly brushed Darius's ear. The voice was quiet enough to hide behind civility, but sharp enough to scar. "Best to keep quiet, boy." The word boy landed heavier than the gavel had. It carried years of history of doors shut, of dignity stolen. I felt the sting even from my seat. Darius didn't answer. His eyes fell toward his shoes' scuffed leather edges worn thin. They looked like they had walked through too many battles already. And in that moment, you could almost see the memory that rose inside him. His mother hunched over those very shoes years ago, stitching torn seams by the glow of a kitchen lamp. Her voice had been gentle but firm. "Walk with pride, no matter what, even when the road laughs at you." The memory flickered across his face like a candle fighting the wind. He pressed his palms flat on the table as if anchoring himself not to slip further. Sweat gathered at his brow. His lips parted, then closed again, words caught in the prison of fear and humiliation. All around the gallery shifted. Some leaned back, smug, satisfied. A young man scribbled in a notebook, already writing tomorrow's column. A woman with folded arms muttered to her neighbor, "Should have known better than to fight the cops." A group of men near the back grinned, the kind of grin that feeds off another's downfall. But not everyone was laughing. I caught the eyes of a church lady in the front row, hat perched high. She shook her head slowly, lips pressed in a tight, sorrowful line. Next to her, a college student lowered his phone, expression unsettled, as if the script he'd expected wasn't matching the truth playing out before him. Even so, the louder current in the room was ridicule, not mercy. The majority had chosen their story, a black man arrogant enough to defend himself, if finally slapped down. Darius sat motionless, staring at the grain of the wood beneath his hands. His thumb brushed once across the face of that old wristwatch again. I saw it clearly this time, the small circular motion like he was winding courage out of memory. And for the first time since the doors had closed, I wondered if he might give in, if he might let the silence smother him, let the record stand unchallenged. You could feel the cliff edge beneath him. Despair hung heavy, coiled around his shoulders. The fight in his eyes dim, not gone, but fading like a candle losing wax. The room smelled of paper and polish, but beneath it, I swear, I could sense the odor of something rawer, defeat, humiliation, history repeating itself yet again. It was hard to watch, harder still to accept. A man standing in his own truth, armed with evidence still drowned out by power that didn't need to explain itself. And in that moment, I think many of us believed we were watching the end of it. That Darius had been broken, his voice silenced for good. But if you look at close enough to see the flicker in his grip, set of his jaw, you'd realize the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because sometimes the lowest point is only the breath before a rise. It happened so fast, I almost missed the start of it. One moment, Darius was still hands flat on the table, eyes on the wood grain. The next, his chair slid back with a soft scrape, and he rose, slow, deliberate, like a man stepping onto thin ice and choosing not to look down. He didn't square up, didn't puff his chest. He just stood, spine straight, watch glinting, once under the lights. He leaned a breath toward the microphone. "Your Honor," he said, tone respectful, voice steady enough to carry without strain. "With all due respect, the law protects me too." For half a second, the room held. Then the gallery burst. Laughter broke like dropped glass, sharp, mean, bright enough to sting the ears. Someone behind me crowed, "This guy thinks he's a lawyer." Another voice chimed in. "Tell him to sit down." The sound had that schoolyard flavor. Adults never quite outgrow, the kind that looks for the smallest boy in the nearest shove. The bailiff's mouth twitched, not a smile exactly, more a reflex. Across the aisle, the young prosecutor, Ethan Rowe, rolled his pen and let a grin tug at one corner of his face. He didn't bother to hide it. He didn't have to. The room was doing the work for him. Judge Clark let the laughter burn for a beat too long, then lifted a palm. It cooled to a snicker. She tilted her head, measuring Darius like a misfiled paper. What she asked, the word as dry as a page number, "Could you possibly know about the law?" There are questions that invite answers and questions meant to close doors. This was the latter. It wasn't curiosity, it was a lid. Darius didn't rush into the silence she left for him. He let it stand a moment. He looked up at her. No glare, no flinch, then passed her over the top of the bench as if fixing his gaze on something deeper than the robe or the seal. The watch at his wrist caught the light again as his fingers relaxed. When he spoke, his voice folded into the quiet without pushing. "Enough," he said, plain and clear, "to know it applies to me as much as to you." The laugh that wanted to jump didn't find a landing. It stalled and fell apart. Chairs creaked as people eased forward, suddenly aware of how loud breathing can be. Somewhere a pen clicked shut and stayed that way. The air changed, the kind of change you feel in your shoulders before you understand it with your head. Judge Clark's eyes narrowed a fraction. Not anger yet, calculation. She drew a long breath as if smelling the risk in the room. I looked at Darius. He stood easy but not careless. You could tell he knew exactly what line he was walking. The word contempt lives under every bench, and he had just stepped close enough to see its shadow. A man can end a hearing with one sentence spoken at the wrong temperature. He knew that. You could see it in the way his jaw set, not to bite back words, but to carry the weight of them without dropping. He also knew something else. Silence hadn't protected him. Not at home, not at a door, not here. If he wanted oxygen, he would have to make it. The church lady in the front row stopped shaking her head. She sat up, hands folded around her purse like a prayer she was willing to hold for someone else. The college kid a few seats down lowered his phone and just watched, eyes bright, mouth open enough to catch the next word like a ball. Ethan's grin faded. He flicked his eyes toward the judge, then down at his notes, then back at Darius with a new tightness in his face. The bailiff shifted his stance, one foot back, shoulders braced as if his body had been trained to expect the wrong kind of courage. Darius didn't fill the moment with more. He let the sentence live on its own, let it do the work sentences can do when you give them space. He breathed once, slow and complete like a swimmer, accepting the length of the pool. Judge Clark tapped a finger on the arm of her chair. "This court," she said, careful, "now operates on law, not theatrics." "Then the law will do," Darius answered, and there wasn't a quiver in it. A murmur trembled at the edges of the gallery and fell away. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to quiet, as if their hum knew better than to interrupt. The clerk's eyes went to the judge, then to Darius, then back again like watching a tennis ball without knowing who was serving. Inside that pause, I felt the shape of the room tilt. Not much, not enough to slide anyone off their seat, but enough to change where gravity pointed. The cheap thrill of mockery had drained out. The joke wasn't funny anymore when the man refused to shrink. I wondered if he was afraid. He should have been. He would have been human if he was. You don't talk to power like that without feeling the heat of it on your skin. But fear wasn't the first thing on his face. It was resolve. Not loud, not dramatic. The ordinary kind, the kind people carry to early buses and late shifts, the kind that keeps a foot moving when the sidewalk tilts against you. He glanced just once at the watch. A tiny movement, a circle of a thumb over the glass. Then his eyes came back to the bench. He didn't look at the gallery, didn't beg them to see him. He looked at the only person who could pretend he wasn't there and made it impossible to pretend. Proceed, the judge said, finally, the word tighter than before. Darius nodded once. He didn't launch into a speech. He didn't pound the table. He guarded his breath, kept his voice where it could be heard without being called loud. I understand the charge, he said. I understand the report. I also understand what the statute says about tenants and trespass. A rustle moved through the rows behind me, softer than leaves, louder than doubt. People hear confidence even when they don't want to. Ethan sat forward. Your Honor, he started already reaching for a case citation. Mr. Rowe, Judge Clark said without looking at him, you will have your turn. It was small, that correction, but you felt it land. The room had been pointed one way. Now it needed to decide if it would keep pointing there. Darius didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. He simply accepted the inch and stood as if an inch could be a mile if you held it long enough. I'm not here to perform, he said. I'm here because the law that guards your bench is supposed to guard my door. The line wasn't poetry. It didn't try to be. It was a true thing said plainly. That's why it worked. I heard someone behind me mutter, Not agreement, not yet. Just the sound a mind makes when it brushes against the fact it hadn't planned on touching. Judge Clark drew herself a little taller. Careful, she warned, but it was softer than before. I am, Darius replied. The laughers were done laughing. Even the ones who wanted to keep it going felt the room turn its head. It's strange how quickly noise gives way when a man refuses to play his assigned part. He stood there calm in the storm he hadn't asked for, and I realized we had crossed something invisible. The story had tried to decide itself without him. He had stepped in and claimed a voice inside it. He didn't push further. Not yet. He let the silence settle in his favor for once. He made space for what would come next, the questions, the statute, the cracks he would show us in a report that had looked solid from far away. And in that quiet, a small current of hope threaded the room. Not joy, not victory, just the first faint proof that darkness isn't the same thing as a verdict. We waited for the next breath, the next line, the opening move of a man who had just chosen risk over comfort, truth over quiet. He lifted his chin a fraction enough to open his voice, and the courtroom leaned with him, ready or not, for what he would ask. The silence that followed was almost heavy enough to hear. Darius leaned forward, fingers spread on the table like a man anchoring himself in the middle of a storm. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of something clean and simple. If I trespassed, he asked, each word slow, deliberate, then why is my name on the lease? Why do I have the keys? He let the question hang a beat, then pressed further, his eyes steady on the bench. And if I resisted arrest, then why does the officer's report contradict the timestamp on the building's own camera? The air shifted. A ripple moved through the gallery. The scrape of shoes, the whisper of jackets, the low rustle of people who hadn't planned to listen but suddenly were. For the first time since the doors had closed, the laughter died on its own. The questions were simple, but they cut like glass. They weren't arguments. They were truths presented bare, and in their simplicity lay their strength. Judge Clark blinked once, her jaw tight. For the briefest moment, she didn't speak. Her fingers tapped against the polished wood of the bench. Then, as if to reclaim control, she snapped her gavel down once. Defendant has no standing, she said, crisp but quick, almost too quick. The words had the flavor of habit, not certainty. The murmur grew louder. People looked at one another, brows raised. It wasn't amusement anymore. It was curiosity, even unease. A man near the back crossed his arms, no longer smiling. A young woman scribbled something into her notebook, her eyes darting between the judge and the defendant. And then from the front row, a voice cut through the quiet. Not loud, not shouted, just steady. A woman in a wide-brimmed church hat leaned toward her neighbor, but her words carried farther than she intended. He's right. I read that law, too. It was small, but in a room like this, it was thunder. Heads turned toward her, then swung back to Darius. For the first time, the tide shifted not in his favor yet, but away from certainty against him. Darius felt it. You could see it in the way his shoulders lifted, slightly in the deeper breath that filled his chest. But fear still gnawed at the edges. Sweat gathered at his brow, and his jaw tightened against the tremor in his voice. He knew how fragile this moment was. One wrong move, one wrong tone, and the wall would slam shut again. Inside, he was shaking. He could feel the weight of the room pressing the doubt of the judge, the sneers still lingering at the edges. But there was also something else now. A crack. A fracture in the wall of prejudice that had boxed him in from the start. Small, but real. Enough for a sliver of light to bleed through. He pressed his palms harder into the table, grounding himself. His thumb brushed once across the face of his father's old watch, as if to steady the seconds that suddenly felt sharper. He remembered his father's voice again. Never let them take your dignity. And his mother's too. Walk with pride, no matter what. The pride was hard to feel here, drowned in ridicule and power. Yet in this fragile silence, he sensed that dignity wasn't gone. It was waiting for him to claim it. The gallery felt the shift as well. You could see it in the faces, some skeptical, some uneasy, some reluctantly impressed. The young college kid in the second row lowered his phone for the first time, his eyes wide, caught between disbelief and respect. The church lady, lips pressed in a firm line, nodded once as if to herself. Even the bailiff, arms folded across his chest, leaned ever so slightly forward, his jaw no longer set in smirk, but in thought. Judge Clark, meanwhile, sat still, her gaze hard, but her eyes betraying a flicker, an involuntary pause. She masked it quickly, Gavel still in her grip, but she had heard him, and she knew the room had too. Darius swallowed his throat dry, but his eyes didn't leave hers. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't triumphant. He was trembling, yes, but beneath it there was a steadiness that no gavel could silence. He could feel it now. The story was no longer entirely against him. The wall of certainty that had crushed him since the first moment was cracking. And once cracks appear, they spread. The gallery shifted again, but this time it wasn't to laugh. It was to listen. That was the change. And in a courtroom, listening is the first sign of power moving. Darius let the silence breathe, careful not to crowd it with too many words. He stood there, chest rising and falling, letting the weight of his questions linger. And in that silence, I swear you could feel it, the planting of something small, but alive. A seed, doubt. And in this place, doubt was enough to move mountains. It began with a breath. Darius took one slow and measured, and when he let it go, his voice rode the air like something built to last. Your Honor, he said, the state statute on criminal trespass is clear. A lawful tenant, one with a current lease and keys, cannot be guilty of trespassing in his own leased premises, absent a lawful eviction or court order to vacate. No flourish, no lecture, just the bones of the law set down clean. The room tightened. You could hear the weight of it in the way fabric stopped rustling. The gallery stilled. The church lady folded her hands tighter around her purse. The college kid froze with his phone half lifted. Even the bailiff's chin came up a notch. For a second, the only sound was the fluorescent hum and the slow, patient click of the clerk's pen finding its cap. Judge Clark did not move. Then she did, barely. One blink deliberate. Her mouth flattened into something between a line and a blade. You memorized a line, she said, gavel tapping once, like punctuation. Nothing more. Darius didn't flinch. He let the echo fade, then answered in the same steady tone, eyes level. A court is not above the law, Your Honor. He paused just long enough to make the last two words land. Even you. The intake of breath around me sounded like a single tide. A low surprise rolled through the rows, not quite approval, not quite shock. A few heads nodded before their owners remembered where they were. Someone behind me whispered, he's right, and then swallowed the rest. On the prosecutor's side, Ethan rose straightened like a man who'd heard his cue. He smoothed his tie with his thumb, pushed back his chair, and stepped into the aisle with the kind of confidence you can't teach, only inherit from rooms that have always been arranged in your favor. Your Honor, he began, voice bright, if I may. He didn't wait for permission. He rarely had to. The defendant's statement oversimplifies the statute. In State versus Sanderson, he said the name, like a teacher calling roll the court, upheld a trespass conviction for a former tenant who remained after his tenancy effectively ended. He looked at Darius as if he'd closed a door. Darius tilted his head a fraction. Former tenant, he repeated. After the tenancy ended, he raised his lease from the table, one page neatly folded, the edges softened from being carried. Mine has not ended. It is current. He let the paper speak as much as his voice did. There is no eviction order. There is no notice to quit. There is a key. He tapped his pocket once. That case doesn't apply. A murmur moved through the gallery again. Different this time, curiosity mixing with recognition. The college kid whispered, "He's right about that," to no one in particular. The church lady nodded once as if counting. Ethan's jaw worked. He flipped to another tab as if the answer were color-coded. In People versus Hargrove, he pressed on the presence of a lease did not prevent a trespass conviction where the defendant accessed restricted areas of a building. Restricted, Darius said calm. A boiler room. A locked storage. I entered my hallway and my door. The camera shows me at my door. He didn't look at the judge when he said camera. He looked at the truth as if it were already in the room replaying itself on every flat surface. Again, not the same case. Ethan's voice pitched a little higher. The defendant is cherry-picking. The law is about elements, Darius replied. Either they're met or they're not. He spoke like a man describing a staircase, one step, then another. Current lease, possession of keys, no order to vacate, no restricted area. Those are not cherries, those are facts. The judge's gaze flicked from Darius to Ethan and back again. She rested her forearms on the bench, which around here means the ground is shifting under everyone's shoes. The bailiff's stance changed too, 1 foot back ready, as if his body remembered that courage and chaos looked the same at first glance. Ethan tried to get ahead of it. Your Honor, I'd caution the court against allowing a pro se defendant to, Mr. Rowe, Judge Clark said without looking away from Darius. You'll respond when it's your turn. It was small, that correction, but it made a sound. Respect, or maybe just order, landing in the space where Mockery had lived all morning. Darius breathed not deeper, just truer. If I may finish the point, he said, not as a challenge, but as a man who has learned how to ask for room without apologizing for needing it. The resisting arrest charge rests on the officer's narrative that I refuse commands. The timestamp on the building camera shows me standing still, hands open, asking, "Why am I being arrested?" That is speech, not resistance. Ethan leaned in. The video is unauthenticated. The building's property manager can authenticate it, Darius said. He's in the hallway right now. He gestured and a middle-aged man in a polo flinched, then nodded like someone who hadn't planned to be part of history before lunch. He can also attest that my lease is current. A few in the gallery chuckled, but this time the sound wasn't cruel. It was the kind of laugh people make when a truth walks in wearing its work clothes. The college kid forgot his phone again. The church lady whispered, "Lord help him," but the tone had changed from pity to prayer for victory. Ethan regrouped. Even with a lease, he insisted tenants can be trespassers if they disturb the peace, intimidate neighbors, or ask a question, Darius said. Ethan flushed, or refuse lawful commands. Darius nodded once as though conceding the word while denying its weight. Lawful, he repeated. Commands grounded in probable cause. If the cause is a neighbor didn't recognize me, that is suspicion, not law. The judge's finger tapped the bench again just once. She knew every officer in that report. She knew every neighbor who ever called a fear a fact. She knew the difference between a statute and a story. You could see the math behind her eyes, the old equations rubbing against something new. Ethan reached for indignation. Your Honor, this is not a forum for the defendants, Mr. Rowe, the judge said sharper now. He fell back a step. The pen he'd been twirling clicked against the table and skittered to the floor. He didn't stoop to pick it up. Darius didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He kept the words coming the same way he had started them, careful, grounded. If the state's case relies on reports that conflict with objective time, the conflict matters, he said. If the trespass charge relies on a lease that includes my name, the lease matters. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for the law to apply. The sentence was simple enough to write on a wall. Behind me, a man who'd been grinning earlier rubbed his jaw as if it suddenly hurt to keep it set that way. A woman in a blazer pressed by the look of her underlined something twice. The bailiff's eyes softened by a degree so small you'd miss it if you weren't watching him as hard as he'd been watching Darius. Ethan tried one last angle. Your Honor, the defendant is misrepresenting Hargrove and Sanderson. In both the courts recognize an occupant could. Under facts not present here, Darius said, and this time he did look at Ethan, not long, not challenging. Just a glance that said, I heard you, and I read them too. Ethan's voice went up another notch. He keeps interrupting. He answered your point, Judge Clark said. No gavel this time, just words even and final. That was the moment I felt it stop being a skirmish and start being a hearing again. The noise had drained out of the room. What replaced it wasn't quiet so much as attention. People were sitting forward, elbows on knees, waiting to see where the next brick would go. Darius lifted the lease a second time and held it level. If the court will permit, he said, I can read the paragraph that defines possession. Ethan opened his mouth. Mr. Rowe, the judge, warned not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who understands that order is a kind of mercy. Darius read, not every word, just enough. He didn't press it like a weapon, he laid it down like a map. When he finished, he set the paper flat. His hand drifted to the watch and circled the face once habit, maybe, or a thank you to the seconds that had held. He looked up. He didn't say, see. He didn't say, I told you. He said nothing and let the law do what the law was built to do when someone refuses to leave the room quietly. Ethan stood there breathing a little too fast for a man who'd come forward smiling. He tried to start a sentence and found no place to put it. He tried again louder and earned nothing but the judge's palm lifted for stillness. The court had turned, not spun, not flipped, turned like a great heavy door on hinges that don't bend often but do. And in the hinges' slow swing, you could feel the future of the next minute, the one where the gavel would decide whose words were allowed to live on the record and whose would be left to rattle around in the hallway after lunch. The judge's patience snapped like a twig under a boot. Clark slammed the gavel so hard the clerk nearly spilled her water. This is my courtroom. She barked, her voice sharp enough to cut through every corner of the chamber. Not your lecture hall. The gallery jumped, startled by the force of it. A few smirked again, reassured by the reminder of authority. But Darius didn't flinch. He stood steady, shoulders square, but not stiff. His tone calm, almost too calm for a man standing in that storm. With respect, Your Honor, he said, this courtroom belongs to the law, and the law is clear. He opened his palm as if laying out simple pieces on a table. In State versus Donovan, resisting arrest was dismissed because the defendant merely questioned the officers. In People versus Ellis, the court ruled that passive stillness is not resistance. He paused. I stood still. I asked why. That is on record. His words didn't rise above steady, but they carried one case after another like a drumbeat that refused to stop. The gallery shifted uneasily. The tide had been turning, everyone could feel it, but now the judge's fury threatened to drag it back. Then Ethan Rowe seized his chance. The young prosecutor straightened the smile, returning to his lips, and strode forward with a folder in hand. Your Honor, Ethan said with confidence, the state submits an additional incident report from Officer Daniels. In this, the defendant clearly resists verbally combative, non-compliant, refusing lawful orders. He slapped the pages down like a gambler, throwing aces. A buzz ran through the gallery. Shoulders leaned toward one another. Another report, someone whispered. Maybe he really did fight them. The energy shifted. Unease turned into doubt, then into worry. The church lady frowned, clutching her purse tighter. Even the college kid bit his lip. For the first time since the tide had turned, it looked like Darius might drown again. Ethan saw it too. He paced, letting the pages speak as though they were ironclad proof. He didn't hide his triumph. The court can see he pressed this was no calm tenant. This was a disruptive subject escalating a lawful arrest. All eyes fell on Darius. His hand rested on the watch again, thumb circling the glass. He didn't grab the report in anger. He didn't shout. He simply took it, scanned it once, and then looked up. Your Honor, he said, voice steady. The report is dated April 12th, 8:45 p.m. He tapped the corner of the page. But the building camera shows me already in custody at 8:20. You can see the timestamp. 25 minutes earlier. The words hung there. Ethan blinked. The judge's brow furrowed. Darius laid the report back down. This isn't evidence, he said softly. It's an invention. The gallery erupted. First gasps, then laughter, laughter, sharp and merciless, but not aimed at him this time. He caught him, someone chuckled. The kid doctored it, another muttered, shaking his head. The sound rolled over Ethan like a wave and his smile vanished. He stammered, That's a clerical error, but no one believed it, not with the timestamp sitting there cold and unshakable. Judge Clark's jaw tightened, but she didn't swing the gavel this time. She was watching, really watching the man she'd dismissed not 20 minutes ago. The bailiff, too. His eyes, once filled with boredom and disdain, locked on Darius with something new. Surprise, yes, but behind it, reluctant respect. A man who had seen countless defendants shuffle through this chamber, now staring at one who refused to shuffle at all. I could feel the shift in the room, like a tide changing direction. The gallery leaned in, no longer mocking, but riveted, some even nodding under their breath. For the first time, it wasn't Darius being laughed at, it was Ethan. And in that turn, the current of power began to flow differently. Darius didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stood there, steady, letting the truth do what the truth does when you give it space. And that's when I realized we'd reached the breaking point. The moment when mockery gave way to belief, when doubt cracked wide open and spilled light across the floor. For the first time, it wasn't Darius who looked like the outsider in that courtroom. It was everyone else who had underestimated him. The laughter at Ethan's expense was still hanging in the air when another sound rose from the gallery. Not laughter, not whispers. The sound of an old man's chair scraping against the floor. He stood slowly leaning on the pew for balance, but his presence was steady, commanding, in a way that comes from years of being heard, even when you're not trying to speak loud. A tall figure, hair gone silver glass, is perched low on his nose. "That's Alan Myers," someone murmured behind me. "The professor, who lives 2 doors down from Coleman. He's the one folks go to when they need a letter of petition. Man's been writing for half the block." A ripple moved through the crowd. They knew him. They respected him. Myers cleared his throat, voice carrying like a bell in a quiet chapel. "Your Honor," he said, "if the court will indulge me, I need to speak. Not as a lawyer, not as a witness summoned, as a neighbor, as a man who knows this defendant." Judge Clark's eyes narrowed. "Sir, this is highly irregular." But Myers didn't sit. His hand trembled, but not with fear, with urgency. He held a thick, worn folder against his chest. Its corners bent, the pages inside swelling from years of use. "Irregular," he said, "does not mean irrelevant. Sometimes, Your Honor, the truth doesn't fit neatly into the record." The judge hesitated, gavel resting but unused. She didn't grant permission, but she didn't silence him either. And in that pause, Myers opened the folder. Darius Coleman, he began, voice rising with conviction, has spent years studying law. Not in a classroom, not with professors, not with tuition paid. He studied in the public library day after day, year after year. He read casebooks until the ink wore off the pages. He sat with statutes longer than most students ever sit with teachers. Gasps rippled. A man muttered, "That true." Another whispered back, "I've seen him there, always with a book." Myers lifted a stack of papers from the folder, yellowed at the edge and covered in careful handwriting. He wrote petitions for his neighbors. He helped mothers fight evictions. He drafted letters to agencies when people couldn't afford counsel. And some of those petitions, Myers looked straight at the judge. Now he won. The room erupted, not laughter this time, astonishment, disbelief, voices overlapping in a wave of chatter. Reporters scribbled furiously. The bailiff looked from the gallery to the bench, unsure whether to call for order or listen himself. Judge Clark froze, eyes locked on the stack of notes like they were burning. Ethan Rowe's shoulders slumped. He lowered his gaze to the table, flipping pages he no longer seemed eager to show. Darius sat still, jaw tight, the folder of his life now laid bare for everyone to see. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, colored with something between pride and sorrow. "I shouldn't need years of study," he said, eyes sweeping across the room, "to prove I deserve to be heard." That line cut deeper than the law itself. It wasn't just about the case, it was about history, about every time a man like him was silenced because his voice wasn't draped in titles or robes. The church lady pressed her hand against her chest. The college kid whispered, "He taught himself." All of this, and for the first time that day, not one person laughed. Not one sneer lingered. Faces that had once carried smirks now held something else, respect. I watched it happen the shift. The same gallery that mocked him now leaned forward, listening not with ridicule, but with regard. You could feel it in the way their posture changed, in the way the noise gave way to quiet. A different quiet than before this one, not silencing, but waiting. The twist was not that Darius had once been a law student, some hidden credential pulled from a dusty past. No, it was far more human, far more raw. The truth was that he had clawed his way into knowledge night after night in the glow of library lamps because survival demanded it. His weapon was persistence. His shield was self-taught law. That was the hidden truth. And when it landed, the courtroom could no longer see him as a trespasser or even just a defendant. They saw him for what he was, a man who refused to let ignorance be forced upon him, who refused to let silence win. For a long moment, the courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Judge Clark sat frozen, one hand still gripping the gavel but not lifting it. Her other hand rested on the bench, and I swear I saw it tremble just slightly enough to betray what her face worked so hard to hide. Her eyes, usually sharp and unwavering, drifted down toward the stack of papers Alan Myers had held then, to Darius himself. She looked at him not as a defendant anymore, but as something else, an interruption to her certainty, a mirror she hadn't wanted placed before her. Darius rose again. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood with the kind of stillness that commands attention, the kind forged when a man has had everything stripped away except his right to speak. "I do not ask for mercy," he said, his voice clear, ringing against the paneled walls. "I ask for justice." The words landed like a stone in still water. No one moved. No coughs, no shuffling papers, no whispers. Even the lights seemed quieter, their hum swallowed by the silence. The gallery leaned forward, their faces caught between awe and shame, shame at how quickly they'd laughed at him, before awe at how firmly he stood now. Judge Clark blinked, her lips pressed tight. Her jaw worked once, twice, as if forming words that refused to come. Then she exhaled slowly, shoulders sinking beneath her robe. She looked down at the bench, then back at Darius. "This court," she began, her voice lower than before, less a decree and more a confession. She paused, and for a heartbeat it seemed she might stop herself, take it back. But the words pressed forward anyway. "Was wrong to silence you." Not cinematic, not grand, just true. The kind of truth that doesn't need polish because it carries its own weight. A ripple moved through the gallery. Gasps, a murmur, then quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they are standing at the edge of something they never expected to witness. Ethan Rowe, who had strutted earlier, with confidence dropped his gaze to the table. His pen lay untouched, his notes useless. The color drained from his face, as though the fight had been pulled from him bone by bone. The bailiff, the same man who had mocked Darius with a muttered boy not an hour earlier, stood straighter. His eyes, once cold, once careless, now held something entirely different. He gave a small nod, subtle but real, the kind of gesture a soldier gives another after watching him endure what no one else could. Respect reluctant, but undeniable. I looked around the gallery. Faces had changed. Where there had been smirks, now there were sober eyes. Where there had been laughter, now there was quiet respect. People who had once seen a nuisance in a suit now saw a man who had forced the law itself to listen. And me, I felt it too. That rare mixture of satisfaction and awe, the sense that for once the scales had tipped where they should. For once, truth had been allowed to stand taller than prejudice. There was no cheer, no applause, just the heavy electric quiet of justice settling into the room like dust after a storm. And in that stillness, I felt what everyone else must have felt too. Something had broken, and something had begun. When the gavel finally fell for the last time, it did not carry the same cold authority it had before. It was softer now, less like a hammer, more like a sigh. The case was over. The words had been spoken. The record had changed. The gallery rose in a shuffle, but the sound was nothing like the noise that had filled the room earlier. No laughter, no mocking whispers, just quiet footsteps, hushed voices, the silence of people, leaving with more on their minds than they'd had when they walked in. They filed out slowly, glancing at Darius, not with ridicule, but with something closer to reverence. Some avoided his eyes, ashamed of how they'd laughed before. Others gave the faintest nods, as though acknowledging a debt they could never pay. Judge Clark remained seated. She stared down at her, bench hands folded in front of her. For the first time, she didn't look at Darius, not directly. It was as if she couldn't. Her jaw was firm, but her eyes betrayed her a flicker of reckoning, of knowing that she had been forced to face a truth she'd buried beneath years of authority. She had been the teacher of the law for decades, and yet today she had been taught, not by a lawyer, not by another judge, but by a man she had tried to silence. Darius gathered his papers with quiet hands. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't revel in the small victory. He simply stood, straightening the old jacket that seemed almost too thin for the weight it had carried that day. And then he walked toward the doors, his steps calm, unhurried. As he stepped into the hallway, the sunlight poured through tall windows, striking his face. The light caught his cheekbones, lit the lines of fatigue beneath his eyes, and turned them into something else, something brighter, something unbroken. It wasn't just light, it was freedom. It was dignity. Professor Alan Myers was waiting near the doorway, folder still clutched to his chest. He reached out, laid a hand on Darius's shoulder, and looked him square in the eye. His voice was steady, carrying more pride than the courtroom could hold. Today, he said, you didn't just defend yourself. You reminded us all what justice means. The words hit like a blessing. Darius bowed his head for a moment, not in weakness, but in the humility of a man who understood the weight of what he had carried into that room. Behind them, the bailiff lingered by the doors. The same man who had mocked Darius earlier, calling him boy under his breath. Now he stood with his cap in hand, eyes following Darius as he walked away. And then just as Darius reached the threshold, he gave the smallest nod. Not grand, not obvious. Just a simple tilt of respect. It was almost nothing, and yet in that tiny gesture you could feel the tremor of something larger. Change. The sunlight followed Darius out of the courthouse, spilling onto the steps. He paused there for a moment, looking out at the city that had once treated him as a suspect in his own home. He breathed deep, letting the air fill his chest. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying the weight of being unheard. He was simply himself, whole, steady, free. And those of us who witnessed it, who sat in that courtroom and watched the tide turn, felt something settle inside us. A reminder that justice is not a statue carved in stone. It is alive, fragile, and it depends not only on the laws we write, but on the people who choose how to wield them. Sometimes the law doesn't need to change. Sometimes it's the people who enforce it. That truth stayed with me long after I left the room. It clung to the steps, to the echo of the gavel, to the quiet nod of a bailiff, to the voice of an old professor, and to the steady walk of a man who refused to be erased. And even now, when I think of that day, I feel the same chill I felt then, the kind that makes your skin prickle, your chest tighten, and your spirit stand taller. Because justice for once had spoken where it mattered most. And that's the heart of today's story. A reminder that justice is not about power, but about dignity, persistence, and truth. Darius showed us that sometimes the bravest act is refusing to stay silent, and that even the smallest crack of courage can break through walls of prejudice. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others who believe in fairness, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful tales like this. Your support is what fuels our team, giving us the strength and motivation to keep bringing you stories that matter. At Mr. Max Stories, we carry one simple symbol with us, a voice that refuses to be silenced. With your help, that voice grows louder every day.